Hi there, I'm Paula Jameson. I'm your host. We're coming from Public Media Network in Kalamazoo, Michigan, and we have a very interesting program today. Some of you know I'm an occupational therapist, and I have taught for the graduate program in holistic health at Western Michigan University. And because of that, and as part of that, I've had this lifelong interest in all kinds of approaches to healthcare and wellness. And today we're very fortunate. Kalamazoo has a quite new program in Ayurvedic medicine. And we are fortunate to have the Dean of Students of this program, Bill Courson, and we are going to talk about Ayurveda. And so I would like to turn our attention to Bill, and I would like for you to help us understand a little bit about what Ayurveda is.
Well, I'd be very happy to, and thank you so much, Paula, for having me here today. It's a pure delight to be here.
Thank you, thank you. Well, let's just start at the beginning. Could you just give us kind of a thumbnail sketch for the layperson of what is Ayurveda?
Surely, I would be happy to. Let's look at the word Ayurveda. Ayurveda is a word that comes down to us from the language of ancient India, the Sanskrit language. And the word is divided into two parts, Ayur or Ayush, Veda. Literally, it means exactly what the word biology means from the Greek. Bio, life, ology, the study of, Ayur, life, Vedya, the study of. But in context, it doesn't simply mean the study of life. It's the study of longevity. In other words, the study of how to enhance and augment life.
Okay, so you're saying, this is clearly then, it's an ancient tradition,
yes,
focusing on health, and it sounds like it's a very encompassing, broad definition of health. Could you say a little bit about that?
Yes, indeed. There is Ayurveda or Ayurvedic medicine, as some prefer to style it, places a great deal of emphasis on the unity of the organism and consciousness. We're not just a body, we're a body, we're a mind, and we're also a spirit. And let me encapsulate a broad principle for you in a very brief fashion. Events that impact upon the mind and upon the spirit can manifest results in the body. Events that unfold in the body can manifest in the mind and the spirit. Think of the last time that you were very anxious or angry or in some emotionally unpleasant state. Think of the impact on, for example, your stomach, or your breathing, or your posture, or the way you held yourself together. So that's.
And these things, what you're talking about, are things that I think for most of us are very intuitive.
They are.
And we may not, if we start sort of unpacking them in the modern Western medical scientific way, we may be realizing that those kinds of awarenesses on the scientific level are just starting to happen. People are just starting to look at how a physical event might impact our emotional state.
Or vice versa.
Or vice versa.
Yes, that is something that has come to the cognizance of, not to the fore of Western, what I call Western biomedicine, in the past 3/4 of a century, perhaps. But it's a given, and we all know it at an intuitive level, because we've all experienced it, we've all felt it.
But Ayurveda has really worked with this and developed it in, from what I understand, to a very high degree.
Indeed it has. It's had 5,000–6,000 years, maybe more, to elaborate its body of principles. So yes, that's exactly right.
And so could you tell us a little bit? I mean, we understand it comes out of India. It's clearly very ancient.
Yes.
Is this a tradition that we have an awareness of how it's evolved over time, or do we just sort of see it?
No, we do have a good sense of how Ayurveda developed and evolved. One of the problems when you talk about ancient India is this. The ancients tended not to write things down. They were very much more biased in the direction of maintaining a lineage or maintaining a tradition orally. And this was probably due to at least two reasons. One, the fear that reducing something to a written text could lead to its misinterpretation or its corruption.
Or misuse
You know,
in some way.
it's just
yeah.
a couple of letters from kiss the patient to kill the patient, right? So you could have that kind of textual corruption or misunderstanding.
right.
The feeling was that information conveyed from the mouth of the teacher to the ear of the student would be much less likely to be corrupted over time. So there was a strong oral bias in terms of the transmission of Ayurveda in its earliest forms. Ayurveda's written canon, and it has a large written canon, did not become reduced to writing until very, very late
Okay.
in its history.
And how late would that be?
If Ayurveda has been in actual use and practice for a minimum of 5,000 or 6,000 years, the first Ayurvedic written works would have appeared, best estimate, 800 BC to 400 AD.
Okay.
So very late in its history. But these works were compilations of knowledge that had existed not for centuries beforehand, but for millennia beforehand. And we can use that millennia word there because there is archaeological evidence of it. It's having been used.
Okay, well, let's talk a little bit about what does this, how does Ayurveda manifest in the way, why would I go see an Ayurvedic practitioner, for example? What sorts of things bring people to see these practitioners? Is Ayurveda, clearly this is a program here in Kalamazoo, so it's no longer just limited to India.
Indeed, no, nor to the east or west coasts.
Okay,
yes.
right,
It's begun
yes.
to penetrate the hinterland.
We're here at the
yes.
third coast here
Yes.
in Michigan.
That's
right.
right.
That's right. So perhaps you can say a little bit about maybe just the general way that Ayurveda approaches illness and patients. And
I'm going to do that. I'm going to have to contrast it with contemporary
Perfect.
Western medicine,
Perfect.
which I call biomedicine.
Okay.
Biomedicine is a wonderful thing. Thank God that there is such a thing as contemporary Western medicine in the world. It is very, very good at some of the things that it does. It is very good at, for example, handling trauma, at handling acute, potentially lethal processes in a very expeditious manner.
Okay.
In doing that and doing it well, its primary focus is on suppressing symptoms, which is perfectly all right. You want to suppress some symptoms. Fever, bleeding, pain are symptoms. No one wants those. But in focusing its attention and resources on doing that, it tends to deprecate the question of what is causing the process. Now, if you've been in a traffic accident, we don't need to know what the cause of your problem is. We know what the cause of your problem is. But if you're manifesting some chronic, refractory problem like bronchial asthma or rheumatoid arthritis or fibromyalgia or chronic fatigue syndrome
Right,
or post-infection chronic Lyme syndrome or any of these long-term indolent things that seem to hang on, Western medicine doesn't really look at causes. Ayurveda does, and it has its own whole theory, a rather elaborate theory built up around what those causes are and how to address them. So the first reason why a contemporary American person or Western person would want to look at Ayurveda is it's effective at treating the cause of disease, not simply at eliminating symptoms. When you eliminate symptoms and leave a cause unaddressed, that cause is going to manifest itself usually in increasingly severe ways.
Well, your body, your body-mind system is trying to get relief on some
That's
level.
exactly the case.
I mean, it's kind of, I think of the engine light on your car.
Yes,
you
that's
know,
exactly
you don't put
right.
a piece of tape over the engine light on your car and keep
no,
driving.
No, that's a wonderful analogy. Yes, that's exactly right.
Right.
So Ayurveda, the first reason would be that Ayurveda seeks out causes and attempts to eliminate them. Okay, that is the basis of its entire practice. The second reason for seeking out Ayurveda is that it is effective. It has brought health and happiness to countless millions or hundreds of millions or billions of individuals over a huge extent of time. In that effectiveness, it is also safe. Ayurvedic therapeutic procedures don't have anything approaching the intensity of, well, some of the adverse events that can occur in response to biomedical therapies.
Okay, so let me just back up and sort of talk about that on maybe a different level. So one of the things we're aware of, for example, in Western medicine, more and more are, for example, side effects of drugs. And that people who are taking drugs or these compounding effects, if you're taking, and we see this a lot in older people, where they're taking many, many medications.
Yes.
And each medication had a specific purpose, but altogether they may be doing something that nobody intended.
That certainly is the case. The human physiology is like a house of cards. If you've ever tried to build a house of cards as a child, you know if you move one card, the entire is affected and the entire house of cards may come toppling down. So that is exactly the case.
So then what you're saying too is that the approaches, the kinds of treatments are less, we would use the word probably invasive too, than what we're typically accustomed to.
Yes, and that leads into the next reason for making use of Ayurvedic treatment. We have a saying. Ayurveda has a lot of proverbs and sayings, and one of them is first the word, then the herb, then the knife. And what that means is you always seek out treatment at the least invasive, least life-disrupting, most conservative, gentlest level. That's always your first line of attack when you're dealing with some pathology. In the wake of its inadequate effectiveness, one moves on to the next rather more invasive or impacting level of therapy. But one starts out with minimally impacting things such as lifestyle guidance, fitness and yoga protocols. Certainly, clinical nutritional therapy is in the forefront, and hopefully those will be effective in dealing with the problem, whatever that problem may be. Another reason, the third reason why an individual would want to seek out Ayurveda is that medical care is very expensive. Conventional Western biomedicine is very expensive, is not, in spite of many efforts to make it so, as nearly universally available as it ought to be. And it's not effective in very many instances. This past week has seen a number of headlines run in the New York Times on the ineffectiveness of antidepressants. I don't know if you've seen those, but one very prominent researcher said that if you are on antidepressants, the best thing you could do for yourself is get off them as quickly as possible.
Yes,
So.
and so we're seeing some of these kind of magic bullet drug solutions that were kind of embraced over a long period of time, discovering that the actual effectiveness is not so great. I hear that about allergy medicines.
Yes,
for
yes,
example.
yes, that's right. Or that they lose their effectiveness over a relatively short period of time.
Right, the body becomes habituated.
So the safety, the availability, and the efficacy of Ayurvedic medicines, you know, I have no doubt that if you were to look into your kitchen pantry, you would find herbs and spices that there's a pharmacy in your kitchen
And
waiting to be discovered.
And that my dear bohemian great-grandmother probably could have told me about some of them too, you know?
Well,
Some of the old folk medicines.
you know, whether
yeah.
your grandparents were from Bohemia, Moravia, or
Exactly.
Slovakia, or wherever they were
Right.
from, they were the custodians of a healing legacy, where at a time where there were no physicians.
That's right.
You
You had
know,
to do something. Yeah.
if one developed an illness, one would consult the village herbalist or wise woman or grandma or whoever happened to be in place with the knowledge, or would consult the village bone setter
Right.
in the event of trauma. So yes, that's exactly right.
Well, before we go into more detail about history and so evolution of Ayurveda, I'd like maybe a little bit of a picture about how the care is delivered. Are there clinics? Are there hospitals? I imagine things are very different here in the West than they might be in India. But could you say a little bit about how it's
Surely, in India, probably the care in terms of healthcare given to the people of India, the bias numerically is somewhat toward Ayurveda, with a large presence, not large enough, but a large presence of Western medicine, Western medical care. Western medical care tends to be inadequately available. Where it is available, it often tends to be truncated for lack of resources.
Yes.
Ayurveda is, well, Ayurveda is the heritage, the healing heritage of the people of the Indian subcontinent.
Yes.
People grew up with it. They know it. That to a large extent, it is self-care. No one consults an Ayurvedic physician in the case of something that's not immediately addressable through home measures. Ayurveda is taught as a graduate medical discipline in Indian universities.
Okay.
In India, there are presently 264 university-affiliated faculties of Ayurvedic medicine and surgery, at which one, attends the same way that one would a Western medical school for 5.5 to 6 years and graduates with a degree Bachelor of Ayurvedic Medicine and Surgery, B.A.MS.
So it's a very extensive, formally prepared process.
Particularly,
these days.
yes, particularly now. Since 1947, with the achievement of Indian independence, a great deal of resources that had been previously put into other realms of health promotion were put into Ayurveda. And the present Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi, who was a great patron of Ayurveda, has actually established within his cabinet a separate department of Ayurveda and traditional medicines. Ayurveda, yoga, and traditional medicines, and his government is doing a great deal to promote the study, practice, and utilization of Ayurveda throughout the subcontinent.
Well, I would imagine too, this is coming out of a worldview that's really part of the whole Indian culture, and it would make a lot of sense that people would be comfortable with that, and that the government has sort of consciously decided to support it. Seems very, very positive.
It is indeed.
Yeah,
It is indeed a wonderful.
Let's talk a little bit about here in the West and in Europe and in the States. Now, for most of us, I mean, you wouldn't just kind of look in the yellow pages or look online these days and say, oh, well, I'm going to go to an Ayurvedic doctor. So how do people find these practitioners? And what do you call yourselves? Do you call yourselves doctors? Do you call yourselves, what do you call yourselves?
Because Ayurveda everywhere outside of India and the countries adjacent to India is not a licensed healthcare modality, and Ayurvedic practitioners are not licensed healthcare professionals, unless one happens to be a doctor or to have a doctorate in a licensable discipline. One, even if one has a doctorate, one does not use the
Yes.
title, because we don't want to give rise to a misconception that we're physicians. We're not physicians. Those are pretty much the first words that come out of my mouth when I see a new client in my own
well,
practice.
and this is, I wanted to get that out there because I think it's very easy to get confused. And in our
Yes.
world, to be a doctor is so highly regulated and licensed and everything that, yeah, you wouldn't want to give people a false impression.
Indeed, no. It's necessary right away to have one's client, not patient, client. Realize that whatever transpires in the course of an Ayurvedic consultation is best viewed as an educative process rather than a medical one. If you come to me for help, you're going to tell me something of your history, your individual and familial medical history, and your social history if it's pertinent. And on the basis of the information you give me, I will share with you information as to how Ayurveda traditionally would deal with your problem or set of problems. How do people find you asked how people would find an Ayurvedic practitioner. Well, there are a number of Ayurvedic professional organizations. Directories of practitioners are accessible very easily online. If you type the word Ayurveda and the name of a city or state, you'll certainly come up with a listing of Ayurvedic practitioners. And oftentimes one is called from an individual who has absolutely no idea of what Ayurveda is, but the sound of the word appealed to them. Or they may be a yoga practitioner and have some vague conception that there's something called Ayurveda that claims to be yoga's sister science.
Yes, yes.
Then you will have individuals who do know what Ayurveda is, who are fairly well informed and well educated healthcare consumers who have either tried Western medicine and found it to be ineffective, who have tried Western medicine and found what cures it offered were as bad as the disease or possibly worse, who have been given a diagnosis, but rather than even attempt to use Western biomedical therapeutic approaches, want to know what Ayurveda will do for them. And then you have what I call the worried well, individuals who are interested in maintaining an optimal or near optimal state of health and want to know what Ayurveda has to give them in terms of their ability to do that.
To kind of fine tune what's going on.
Exactly.
Exactly. Well, I want to go back just a minute because this is so interesting. You mentioned yoga, and obviously yoga, I think, is much more familiar to many more people.
Oh, yes.
And you mentioned this sort of almost sister relationship between the two. Can you just say a little bit about that?
Well, they are sister sciences. You know, they both grew up together in ancient India. They both have a very, very, in fact, identical conceptual underpinning.
Okay.
Ayurveda is somewhat more, what should I say, oriented toward the care of the mind. I'm sorry, yoga is somewhat more oriented toward the care and cultivation of mind. Ayurveda is somewhat more oriented toward the care and cultivation of body. But they share a great deal in common. And yoga is a standard therapeutic measure that is used in Ayurveda to achieve specific health ends. It is, well, you know, there's an ongoing argument between yoga and Ayurveda practitioners. The yoga practitioners argue that Ayurveda is a slice of yoga's pie, and Ayurveda is arguing that yoga is a slice of Ayurveda's pie, and vice versa.
I love it. People are people everywhere, aren't they?
People are people everywhere, yes.
Well, that's helpful, and you know, what I'm seeing too, and maybe this is incorrect, so you can comment on this, but yoga seems to me, at least in the way I understand it here in the West, has this kind of sense of being an ongoing supportive practice, whereas Ayurveda may be more brought in if there's some sense of being out of balance or illness or something like that. Now, that may be incorrect, but that's kind of...
No, well, no, it's not incorrect, but Ayurveda exists not only for the purpose of righting wrongs. It exists for the purpose of preventing wrongs from arising, preventing disease. So an Ayurvedic lifestyle is an Ayurvedic lifestyle. One is conscious of what one is eating, what one is doing, the emotional attitude with which one is doing whatever one is doing. It is an ongoing lifestyle practice in the same way as yoga. I think a large part of the reason for the divergence between the popularity of yoga and the popularity of Ayurveda, which obviously many more people know about yoga than Ayurveda, is that yoga's been here for a very long time. It came to England and afterward to North America in the 1870s and 1880s and very much the 1890s. Ayurveda first made its presence felt here in the 70s and 80s with a wave of immigrants from India and other South Asian countries who brought it with them. And some of these individuals were physicians, some were professionals who cultivated and promoted awareness of and interest in Ayurveda.
That's great. That's really interesting. Well, let's talk maybe a little bit about, I mean, you've kind of given us a general portrayal of the, I would say, holistic and kind of preventive aspects of Ayurveda. Could you maybe talk about sort of give us a scenario maybe of, and you know, just invent someone who might be seeking out treatment and the kind of thing they would be looking for help with. And then you've mentioned sort of dietary advice and things, but maybe talk about some specific kinds of things that might be helpful that they would be encouraged to do.
Yes, let us say, just as a way of illustrating, that an individual consults me or another Ayurvedic practitioner for a problem. They've either already consulted a Western physician and have been told that theirs is a problem without a solution, or they may have actually utilized some Western biomedical therapy or group of therapies, found them to be ineffective, found the side effects to be intolerable, whatever the reason. As I said earlier, Ayurveda always attempts to treat at the least invasive level possible. When I see an individual come to me, I make an assessment of their overall state. Now, without getting too deeply into this, Ayurveda postulates that there are certain types of people. We're all unique individuals. But we're unique in the proportionality of three forces or energies that pervade our organism. This gives rise to certain types of individuals, somatotypes, bodily types. But it's not just a bodily type, it's a body-mind typology. And what is unique about each individual is the precise proportionality of those energies that are present. Just to let you know, we call these doshas, but this is something that we'll explore in detail.
Later. Yes,
And there are three of them, and they each have their behaviors, their appearances that are characteristic. They also have their vulnerabilities. So if you know what an individual's dosha is, it's all very interesting, but the usefulness is you know what they need to do to maintain an optimal or near optimal state of health. You know what they need to avoid to maintain an optimal state of health as well. You know what types of problems they're vulnerable to, and you know how to address those problems. So it's an extremely important and useful piece of information. Let us say, by way of illustration, that someone came to me with sciatica.
Okay, that's a common one, yes.
It can make you as miserable as miserable can get. Well, let us say that an individual came to me with sciatica, and we're using Western therapeutic modalities to treat it, and we're finding them either to be ineffective or found the side effects to be intolerable, okay? Or perhaps unaffordable. That's something that we have to consider also, because not everyone has medical insurance, although that's everyone's aim. It's just we're not there. That individual, after having made an assessment overall, I would have conducted a complete individual and familial medical history. I would have examined the individual from the perspective of Ayurveda. A physical examination puts great emphasis on the individual's overall conformation or appearance, their posture, their movements, the pitch of their voice, their eyes, their tongue, and most especially their pulse.
I was going to ask, because I know that's so important in Chinese
Yes.
medicine.
It is,
Tibetan
and
medicine.
actually it's important in a great many lineages of traditional medicine and folk medicine. Because Ayurveda never evolved the endoscopy, we can't look inside your body using an instrument, so we have to take what is visible on the outside as an indicator of what processes are unfolding within. Okay, so after having conducted an examination, or any Ayurvedic practitioner would be able to determine what is this individual's baseline, what is their best, most optimal balance of these doshas. How far have they strayed from that?
Okay.
Another question we would need to ask is, have they been at a distance from their optimal state for so long that they are becoming intoxicated? That is to say, do they have a significant burden of toxins?
Because the system hasn't been functioning in an optimal way,
Yes.
so that ability to detoxify has been impaired.
Yes. Very often, if the individual has been in this state, has been in this suboptimal state for a period of time, the means by which the metabolism rids itself of toxins has become inefficient, sluggish. Toxins begin to build up in the body at the cellular and tissue levels. And it is at that point that sometimes we have to move a little bit beyond lifestyle guidance, fitness protocols, nutrition, and yoga certainly, to implement a little bit more deeply acting, more impacting forms of
And that
therapy.
would be sort of where the medicines came in.
That's exactly right. At that
right.
point, one looks to such things as herbal and herbometallic medication, to various types of manipulative body therapies, and to some rather more rigorous detoxification strategies. It is at that point where the individual needs to be substantially detoxified before the doshas can be manipulated back to their original optimal position.
So what I'm hearing here is that for many people seeking help, it might be really a question of showing them what they need to do to kind of support their system so that it functions. You know, I'm putting it in kind of crude Western terms, but supports their system so it's really going to function at a more optimal level. But then you do reach a critical point in this sort of arc of wellness to disease where you kind of have to bring in more specific treatments.
Up to a certain, to a certain point, the organism is ready, willing, and able to defend itself, to repair itself. It simply wants you to stop shoveling garbage in it and get up and move and do a little bit of exercise. Get some sunshine. Try to tear yourself away from your computer or iPad. And this can go on for a rather long time. You know, to say that one's doshas are imbalanced is not to say that one is a sick person, but the stage is set for it. The stage is set. So hopefully we will see a client early on when they haven't been treating themselves well, they haven't been exercising, they haven't been eating appropriately, they've taken one too many trips to the salad bar, and what happens is with a little bit of guidance and a little bit of adjustment, things can be set right. And as I say, this can go on for a very long time.
Well,
however, there is ultimately
what I find very sort of engaging and appealing about this is that it's really asking people to do something that we're hearing kind of from our medical system, but in a much more sort of, you know, naughty person, you're not doing this, to be aware of what's going on for them. and to develop some sort of sensitivity to, oh, you know, I'm not quite right now, before the crashing headache start, or before they're just so fatigued that they can't function.
Exactly. Get into a conversation with your body. Realize that as this process of imbalance begins, symptoms and signs are likely to be mild, diffuse, and vague. One might get up in the morning and one just doesn't feel right.
Feel off.
You have it's not enough of a pain to call a headache. It's almost it's almost a phantom headache, you know, or something hurts, or something's not moving well, or why could I move my shoulders so much one day and not that? I feel a little nauseous and I don't know what. It's these vague little indicators that, and this I think is one of the real jewels in Ayurveda's crown. I like to think that Ayurveda has two jewels in its crown. One is its detoxification strategies that it can call into play when things have gotten relatively bad. The other is its ability to understand and discriminate with great precision the disease process at its beginning stages. You know, Ayurveda postulates a 6-stage theory of how diseases begin and develop and spread, and Western biomedicine, a well-trained Western biomedical practitioner, will be able to discern the presence of a disease at stage 5 of that 6-stage process. A well-trained, experienced Ayurvedic practitioner can discern the beginnings of that process at stages 1 or 2 or 3, when things are much easier to treat, much cheaper to treat, are quickly resolved, and are much more amenable to treatment.
Yes.
So that, I think those are the real jewels in Ayurveda's crown.
Yes, and that's a whole different, I mean, we're talking about really a very different worldview in a way about how the body manifests disease or wellness too. And I think maybe, I don't know what it was like, you know, back before medicine became so regulated and we had to rely on more local people who didn't have the sort of tools at their disposal that we have, that are so, as you say, effective for the big stuff. I mean, if you've got somebody who's having a major heart attack, you want somebody to be able to come in and, you know, hopefully stop it, and, you know. But we're not so good
if they're there.
If they're still there, yes, if they're available. But we're not so good at people who live in community with other people and who can, you know, who know their clients or their patients too, who would recognize that this person isn't him or herself right now. If you're seeing a physician 2 or 3 times a year, they're not going to know if you're not yourself or not. They don't know you. So there's that whole,
that certainly is true.
Yeah, so there's that whole other dimension that's going on there.
That certainly is true.
Yeah. Well, let's see. We were talking a little bit about history of Ayurveda, and it does sound like much of it is lost in the mists of time. But as it's come to the West particularly, there are training programs, obviously. The BVI, School of Ayurveda here in town is doing that. How are individuals trained in this, you know, rather, it sounds like subtle system of...
Well, until the middle of the 1980s, that training was acquired either by going to India, by going to a university school of Ayurveda in India, which very few Westerners have done. One could count them on the fingers of one's hands. There are very few. Or one could have apprenticed oneself to an Ayurvedic practitioner, probably from India, and studied with that individual for a number of years. One could have acquired the information informally by reading what few books on Ayurveda were published in the English language, you know. There were a variety of means by which the information needed for the practice of Ayurveda could be experientially acquired. Beginning in the 1980s, the first training institutions intended to train Westerners, as Ayurvedic practitioners, began to be founded in California, in New Mexico, in Arizona. For whatever reason, the bias was on the West Coast.
Right, often is, yes.
Yeah. And in the 1990s, more Western-trained Ayurvedic practitioners and more Indian Ayurvedic practitioners trained in India began establishing training programs for Westerners, formalized training programs for Westerners who wanted to learn and practice Ayurveda here in the United States and Canada, and Western Europe as well. And those programs, perforce the operation of medical practice laws, did not and could not graduate individuals licensable as physicians. So Ayurveda's thrust, beginning back then, was pretty much reified as an educational process, an empowering process by means of which there was this sharing of information. This is what you need to do to maintain your health or to recover your health if it's been lost. Today, I would say there are about 30 Ayurvedic practitioner training programs across the country, which are of 1 or 2 years duration, intended to educate individuals who, if they're graduates of 1-year programs, are generally styled Ayurvedic health consultants. If they're graduates of 2 or more year programs, are styled Ayurvedic practitioners. So many of those initially trained Western Ayurvedic practitioners have become Ayurvedic educators.
That's interesting. That helps me a lot to get the lay of the land here. Now, what can you just sort of give me an overview of the of the course of study that, say, I wish to, you know,
Surely, yes.
Go the full route and become a practitioner. Where would I start?
Well, let me use BVI School of Ayurveda as my illustration, which is quite typical of such institutions. One would begin one's training, and training at BVI is in the form of 1 intensive weekend per month that is given over to lectures and group activity. This takes place 1 weekend per month over the course of a year, with a great deal of homework and directed reading occurring between those monthly classes. One would begin one's training with a study of Ayurveda's history, which we've talked about briefly. Its oral tradition and its written canon. There are certain foundational works. One could almost call them scriptures from the way that they're written in Ayurveda that one would study. Not for their content, one wouldn't be learning Ayurveda from them, but about Ayurveda's development. One would study the philosophic, the scientific philosophy underlying Ayurveda, as well as its nomenclature.
Of course,
now, just as Greek and Latin were the languages of medicine and of law and of theology, they were the scholarly languages of the West, so it is that Sanskrit, the ancient language of India, forms the scientific nomenclature of Ayurveda.
Makes sense, yes.
And so they would get an orientation to the history, the literature, the nomenclature, and the conceptual taxonomy of Ayurveda. This is what I mean by conceptual taxonomy. Much of the information presented in the study of Ayurveda, particularly in its basic science realms, is the same as the West. It's just very differently compartmentalized, and that takes a bit of getting used to. There also are some uniquely Ayurvedic conceptions, such as the theory of the doshas, which we'll be visiting again.
Revisit, yes.
So that's how one begin one's study. As one proceeds through the course, one would study these doshas in great detail, where they are, what direction they're moving in, what they do, and what they look like in health and disease. We can look at an individual and examine an individual and say, well, this is a balanced dosha.
So you are
and
beginning in all of this, just as you would, like when I became an OT, I started seeing people very differently because I was looking for things that OTs looked for.
Yeah.
And so as a kind of practitioner in training, you're starting to see the world of humans and the world at large in a very different way.
Yes, to put it in Western terms, you can't know pathology until you know physiology, and
Right.
you can't know physiology until you know anatomy.
Anatomy,
Never
right.
mind about pharmacology and biochemistry.
Right,
Those come
right.
in. It's very much a building block process. So we take you more or less by the hand and take you through the forest of facts and figures that is
Sure, 'cause
Ayurveda.
you have to, right, yeah.
Ayurveda is one thing about Ayurveda that is a kind of a guide for students and practitioners as well, is that one can always refer back to a body of immutable first principles. When confronted with a complex clinical situation, one can always break it down into its part.
Which is a tradition of analysis in a way,
Yes,
yes.
and refer back to this foundational body of principles. So we take the student through Ayurvedic anatomy and physiology, which really should be called Ayurvedic physiology and anatomy, because in Ayurveda, form follows function rather than otherwise. So there's a great deal of emphasis on physiology, particularly the physiology of the doshas. And from that we move on to a study of Ayurvedic psychology. The structure, function, impact of the mind and mental processes.
Which again goes back to that very holistic, you can't have one without the other idea about body and mind here,
Indeed.
and spirit too.
That
right?
is exactly right. And at that point, the individual has had a grounding in Ayurveda's foundations, its physiological conceptions, its psychological conceptions. One then moves on to a more clinically driven series of courses. We teach a very important course, Ayurvedic nutrition, which is essentially clinical nutritional therapy with some very distinctive Ayurvedic conceptions thrown in. Ayurvedic nutrition, Western nutrition is wonderful. It's the knowledge of calories and lipids and proteins and carbohydrates is all very interesting and very important, but at best it's an incomplete science. Ayurvedic nutrition is a complete science. And, but again, it's language and the way information is compartmentalized is very different from Western nutrition. But we teach our students how to use nutrition as a therapeutic modality, very important course. We then move on to Ayurvedic herbal medicine, in which we teach the use of Ayurveda's traditional plant medicines to effectuate change in the body. We have an actual course in preventive self-care. There's a word for that in Sanskrit. I'll say it, then forget it, because it's not important. It's svastavrita.
It's a beautiful word.
It's a gorgeous word. Self-care. What can I possibly do to avoid having to see the Ayurvedic practitioner in terms of how I clothe myself, how I feed myself, how I practice personal hygienic observances during the various seasons of the year? What do I do? What are my nightly observances? What are the things that I need to do to enhance or promote a healthy night's sleep, on which, by the way, Ayurveda places a huge premium.
Good for them.
We move on then to a discussion detail, and it's a theory course in Ayurvedic pathology, the theory of how diseases originate and develop, and in its application, how can we look at an individual and determine what is wrong with them? And this is carried on in an additional course in Ayurvedic diagnosis. We like to avoid the word diagnosis for you know, it's legal entanglements and say evaluation or assessment. At the end of the day, it is what it is.
It's figuring out what's not going right.
That's exactly so. So we go on with the study of Ayurvedic detoxification strategies. Remember I told you that I thought there were two jewels in Ayurveda's crown, and one of them was its detoxification strategies.
Yes,
It has a number of therapies that it utilizes to remove toxins from the body, or to purge toxins from the body. There are various levels of intensity with which the procedures are carried out. Then we go on and we teach our students the way that Ayurveda would deal with a number of commonly encountered health issues, digestive, respiratory, musculoskeletal and neuromuscular, dermatologic, gynecologic, common things,
yes.
which can be addressed safely, quickly, easily by using measures that one could teach one's client to do for themselves at home.
So with all of this then, is there a kind of an apprenticeship period too, where people actually are seeing other practitioners in action, or?
That is only now being formalized.
I mean, I'm thinking of the internship experience.
Surely,
that so many
surely.
have. Yeah.
That is only now being formulated and institutionalized. The National Ayurvedic Medical, there are a number of Ayurvedic professional associations, the largest of which is called NAMA, the National Ayurvedic Medical Association. They have just promulgated standards relating to the number and quality of CPEs, clinical patient exposures, that one is required to have to achieve certain levels of certification. Now, all of this is only being elaborated now, so it's not really carved in stone. It's carved in jello.
But it's a very exciting time, it sounds like.
It is an incredibly exciting time.
Because it sounds as if this is one of the ways in which Ayurveda is being welcomed into our very chaotic healthcare scene and wellness scene in this country.
Yes, it is an extremely exciting time to be practicing or teaching Ayurveda.
That's really wonderful.
Ayurveda is still a small profession in this country. There are perhaps 1,000 Ayurvedic practitioners and consultants in the country from coast to coast. And it's a very small community. It's a very friendly community. Everyone knows everyone. Everyone talks to everyone. Everyone wants to help everyone.
Isn't that wonderful?
And it really is.
That's really
and
exciting.
Because the standards for, as I said, clinical patient experience and certification are only now being elaborated. It's quite. We're very busy.
Well, it sounds like it, and we are coming to the end of our allotted time. And I would, if you could put your finger on maybe one big thing that you would like to leave our audience with after this first conversation, what to you is kind of the biggest heart thing for you with Ayurveda?
Well, this isn't really specific to Ayurveda, although in a way it is. Pay attention to what your body is telling you. Nothing happens without a reason. There's no such thing as, well, I have a headache, or my back hurts, or I'm not going to the bathroom regularly, or I'm not sleeping well, just because. There is no just because. That's a very anti-scientific way, an anti-Ayurveda way of looking at the world. Everything has a reason. And pay attention to what your body is telling you.
This is such wonderful advice. I feel very fortunate and to hear it myself, and I think our members of the Kalamazoo audience will also appreciate it. Thank you so much, Bill.
Thank you so much. It's been a pure delight.
This is Paula Jameson from Public Media Network in Kalamazoo, Michigan. Thank you so much for joining us. Namaste.
Namaste.
Yes.